Let's talk about wildlife photography, but let's talk about how you can get great photos of animals when you visit zoos, safaris, reserves. It's Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday we bring you a brand new, fresh photography tutorial. This week, we're talking about wildlife photography, but specifically photographing animals in zoos, safaris, and reserves. We recently went to Port Lympne Reserve in Kent with the new Canon R7 and R10, and we got loads of really awesome photos, both while kind of out and about on the safari part and also looking at different exhibits with different animals. But it got me thinking, there's a few challenges to overcome when you're photographing animals at a zoo or reserve or safari. There's a lot of different things that you need to take into account, whether that be composition, whether that be things like cages or fences or bars, trying to remove them from the frame, positioning, light, all that kind of stuff, as well as actually being there at the right time to get a nice photograph of the animal you want to photograph. So let's run through a few tips, a few ways that you can get some great photos of the different animals at the zoos, the safaris, the reserves. Let's get into it. So first up, you need to think about which animals you actually want to photograph. There's going to be a lot of different animals that you might want to be able to look at. You need to make sure there's a few that you definitely want to photograph so that you can plan accordingly. Now, the best thing to do is once you've picked out 3, 4, 5 different animals you definitely want to get photographs of, check when they're going to be fed. Now, this is because otherwise animals will either be often sleeping, they won't be moving much, they might be hidden. Whereas when they're fed, that's when they're going to be most animated, which gets more interesting shots. And they're also going to be able to see them more clearly. They'll be much more visible. Now, this was very evident when we were going around. Things like the bears, the gorillas, the lions, the tigers, they were all hiding right out back. They had a massive area to move around in. So they were hiding behind rocks, sleeping, just generally out of view where they didn't want to be seen. Totally fair enough. But when it came time to feed them, they became much more visible. They came closer to the edge of the exhibit. They were much easier to photograph and they were more animated. So there were more opportunities for different kinds of shots. This is a big one for actually getting better opportunities to photograph these animals, because otherwise it can be very tricky to get those photos, especially if they're hiding towards the back of their exhibit, their area. Once you've identified which animals you want to photograph and you've identified the times, you want to think a little bit about composition. Now, first up, the biggest thing to consider here, especially if they're in an exhibit, is that you need to think about things like the fencing, right? So you're gonna have the fencing at the back of the exhibit and the fencing at the front. So you've got background and foreground. Let's talk about background first of all. Now, this is gonna take a little bit of trial and error, but if you have a zoom lens, it's gonna be a little bit easier. We've talked about zoom lenses in the past and how you can use them to control your background. Well, here you're gonna need to do a little bit of that. You're gonna need to control the background by zooming in and out and moving yourself to minimize that fencing in the background. You really want to try and hide that with foliage, with shadow, anything you can to kind of get rid of that. Even if you zoom in very tight on the animal itself, so you don't have to worry about it, anything to try and remove that fencing in the background. That's mostly just because it's not particularly appealing. It's not something that's going to look so good. Now, of course, the more difficult fencing is going to be in the foreground. Some exhibits will have glass, which is much easier, but otherwise that fencing in the foreground is going to be a bit of an issue because it doesn't look so good and it tells a very different kind of story in terms of the kind of photograph you're going to get. So we need to think about how we can shoot past this fencing. There's a couple of different ways. First of all, a long lens is going to really help. So we were using things like the RF 100-500, the RF 800mm f11. That's a great one to use because it's nice and long. You can shoot through the fencing. Then you just need to get as close to that fencing as you can. That's going to allow you to get past it with a long lens and for it not to be visible in the frame. Now, if you do have to back up, obviously some places you can't get really, really close to that fence. If you do need to back up, not a problem. Use a nice long lens again, and you're going to shoot through that fence. And what's going to happen is that fence is either going to be gone, it's not going to be visible, or if it's slightly tighter fencing, it will be visible, but it'll be completely blurred out. So it'll become a little bit like a highlight. Now, there is a way to get past this as well. It's to move around to find a bit of the fence that's in shadow. And if you don't have a bit of the fence in shadow, you'll just have to work with that highlight, and you can really reduce it in Photoshop or Lightroom or Capture One later on. But if you can find a bit of that fence in shadow, it'll be much less prominent in the frame. Now, if you're shooting photographs while on a moving vehicle, so in a safari part of a lot of these places, so for example, Port Lim, we went around on a big truck, so we were able to look at the animals a little bit closer in much bigger areas. You're probably going to want to use a longer lens again, because the animals are probably going to stay further away from the truck. And you're going to want to use a nice fast shutter speed. That's to get rid of any kind of blur that might come from the bumpiness of the vehicle, moving around a lot like that, and especially with a long lens, that can be a little bit tricky. But a nice fast shutter speed is going to really help to keep those photos sharp, nice and tack sharp, and just a nicer looking photo, especially if the animals are moving as well. That's going to deal with a lot of that different movement. Otherwise, you want to treat this a little bit like a portrait of a person. A lot of the animals will not be so animated, especially outside of feeding time, so you have a little bit of a chance to kind of line up the shot. So you want to think about it like a portrait of a person. Where's the light? Can you move yourself around? Obviously, you can't really control the light. You can't control their pose, but you can move yourself to a degree. So can you move yourself to get nice lighting? Can you move yourself to get a nice angle? You want to focus on the eyes. That's always going to be the most important part. That's going to help tell the story of the animal. And then just think about composition. Do you want the animal looking in frame? Facing their body into the frame, facing out of the frame? What's the kind of feel you want to give with this photo? We often talk about what's the story you're telling with the photo. Well, really that can come down to what's the feel, what's the vibe of this photo? What do you want people to feel when they're looking at it? And you think about that, you can change whether the animal is facing in frame, out of frame, whether you do want to include some of the fencing. That could be quite a powerful statement as opposed to actually trying to remove it. There's a lot of different things that you can do, but you can approach it a little bit like a portrait of a person. In terms of lighting, sometimes it is just about patience, right? You might want to wait for a cloud to cover the sun so that you get that nice softbox effect. You might want to wait till the animal moves into an area under some trees, let's say, so you get nice dappled sunlight. But something to bear in mind is if you're trying to be patient and waiting for the right light, you also need to be ready to take that photo at a second's notice, because the animal's not posing for you. You need to be ready to take the photo when you think it's right. And I would actually suggest, and this is one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give, always just take the photo. You can take another one a bit later, but make sure you come away with something. Because if you're waiting for that perfect light, it might never happen. You can't control the light, you can't control the animal, you can't control a lot of stuff. So make sure you get something to walk away with rather than nothing, and then wait and be patient and see if that does work out for you. Now, if you have any tips of your own, pop them down in the comments. I'd love to hear your tips for photographing animals in zoos and safaris and reserves and all that kind of stuff. I've been saying wildlife photography, but really I suppose it's not wildlife, is it? Because they're not wild. It's more just animal photography or nature photography. But I'd love to hear your tips. Down there, of course, we've got a full list of all the kit used for all these photos, the R7, the R10, the different lenses we used, down in the description. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the video. We've got new content all the time. I'll be seeing you in the next video, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.